Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info.
We'll send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Hi, I'm William, and I am here with Rhonda and Milton, and we're going to talk about design for invisible structures today. And so if we're looking here at our permaculture flower, you'll see that something I like to point out is we have the petals of land, nature, stewardship, building, and tools and technology. However, the other four petals that we have, education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finances and economics, and land tenure and community governance, those are actually 4 of the 7 petals which really constitute invisible structures. So I like to point out that invisible structures are actually the largest part of permaculture if we're looking at our flower.
I would also add, miles of swales will get you nowhere when your community won't support you, or you have nowhere to sell your produce to. That's all invisible structures.
Yeah. And it really does counteract that idea of permaculture just being about crop production.
Exactly. And if you look, invisible structures are so named because they're not obvious, they're not tangible, but they're all around us, from the way we hold land to the way we interact with each other. Mm-hmm. So going on to our first slide, with respect to education, this is an example of homeschooling on the left there, which is pretty much how we used to do things before there were teachers. And Native Americans kind of resisted compulsory education when that first came to being, as this was just the traditional way of learning. And there's a variety of methods that can be used for homeschooling, ranging from classical to Montessori to Waldorf. And the slide on the right is an example of Waldorf education, which follows, in my opinion, a much more natural phase-based way of learning. And Rhonda, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I'm just going to say I homeschooled my daughter until high school, and I'm homeschooling my son, and we use a Waldorf-based curriculum at home. So we can't exactly create the dynamics in a Waldorf classroom, but we can use the methodology and approaches at home. And the Waldorf kindergarten is actually a classroom recreation of what it means to be following the homestead. So Waldorf-based homeschooling and permaculture actually connect very well because it's about tending the home system for the first couple of years of education, and then moving more into art and science and languages and storytelling and all of that, where you can still continue to build and use permaculture skills. And it's so critical to how we create permanent cultures, is how we prepare young children for the next generation, right? As we help them understand the world and what's expected. If we're looking at what we want the world to be, this is the place to start in how we raise and educate our young ones.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, moving on to our next slide. This is where we touch on participatory arts and music, reclaiming our space as actors and musicians rather than spectators. I'm a huge fan of this. I grew up in the punk rock scene, which was really about taking back the means of production of music and getting away from this more elite way of operating where you had people on stage that had to be these tiresome virtuosos, whereas your job was to pay your ticket and stand there and watch passively. It changed things where anyone could get up and do this, and often anyone did, to mixed results, but the point was that everyone had a voice. And I think hip-hop was another example where that really came to the fore for African-American culture, where hip-hop encompassing rap music, graffiti art, breakdancing, all these different things that was open to anyone. In the case of rap music, that's where you didn't even necessarily need an instrument. Other people's vinyl recordings were the instrument, and that became a part of that culture. Performance art and open mic nights where you can just make art on the street. You don't need any sort of pedigree or valuation from others to go ahead and do it. You just go and do it. And this slide on the upper left there is a flash mob in Bilbao, Spain, where people just showed up and danced. And it was, a preset where everyone just turned up and danced in the square. And I think that's just a really cool concept. I think even zombie walks, which people are currently, is a current kind of trend and fad, where people just turn up in makeup and just do these things spontaneously. I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think this is a really juicy topic, personally.
Mm-hmm.
I see that the power of this is in the storytelling, and that we can tell our own story and we can shape it. Whereas the traditional modes of art and music were, the story was given to you. And that's a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
But still, holding that space for people to be creative, the kind of society that allows people to just do this, right, is valuable, to have that creativity and freedom of expression, and even expectation that each person's going to have their creative side that they're nurturing and offering and participating with other people.
I think it's essential. I think that we experience a lot of maladjustment and a lot of difficulty and anger from stifled expression, from people not being able to communicate how they feel. And some of those things are beyond language.
Mm-hmm.
And the next slide is an example of what we call social ecology. And that's a philosophy focused on the redesign of society using ecological principles. And this may be a little bit familiar because it sort of sounds a bit like permaculture, which is not entirely dissimilar. But this was developed by a writer, a philosopher named Murray Bookchin. And it was, again, very similar. It had a reconstructive, ecological, and communitarian ethical approach to society. And advocated for a reconstructive and transformative outlook on social and environmental issues, and a very directly democratic sort of politic to it. And there was a book that he put out in 1981 called Post-Scarcity Anarchism that reads along similar lines. So great minds think alike. Bookchin and Mollison and Holmgren were kind of moving in the same direction, although Bookchin's focus was a little bit more on the social and the political component of it, a little bit less on the environmental, but it is something that is worth checking out.
Mm-hmm.
Our next slide is about action learning, and that's a problem-solving process that was developed by a guy named Roger Evans in 1982, and it has a variety of different applications, but at its core, it's a problem-solving discipline. And Gaia University in the United States famously uses this for self-guided learning. It involves things like active listening, which is listening with your whole person, and breaks everything down into steps. So you'll have next achievable steps when you're going into a learning process. So it's a problem-solving and learning methodology.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of the mentoring process from a group of people that practice the art of mentoring, where the mentor is participating with this. So instead of having a teacher, you're working with a mentor, a group of mentors, and the mentors are able to ask and guide you toward those powerful questions. And then basically you're going on a quest, right?
Mm-hmm.
With this, through this process. So that's what reminds me of.
That's a whole different dynamic.
Yeah, very different compared to an expert standing in front of you spouting off, an information download for you to try and capture and regurgitate later.
In the same way, it almost teaches you how to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than being just this linear thing, it's actually quite circular. You're constantly going through the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Our next slide is about transition culture. It emerged from the transition towns concept, which was originated by Rob Hopkins in Kinsale, Ireland originally, back around 2006, and then has grown since to a whole host of different initiatives all over the world, particularly heavy saturation in Europe, where it's running from strength to strength, and limited degree, but pretty decent spread here in the U.S. as well. But it's essentially a permaculture designed for living in cities, as Rob originally formulated it, and since then it's kind of evolved and people are adapting it to their own individual needs. But essentially it's about building resilience in the place that you're in, and being able to withstand a shock from the outside and still be able to function. So that it does involve things like groups based around food growing, community-owned businesses, which can be breweries or bakeries, and all manner of different businesses. Community relationships, community-owned energy schemes, and really, really focused on local economies and bringing local business to the front as much as possible.
I had some dabbling with transition towns, and I found it is a permaculture design for a small European town. And I think anyone that's interested in transition towns really needs to be aware that it is a permaculture design, and as such you can't just plant it in another place. And that was certainly a learning experience for me. A good one, but not necessarily an easy one.
I had a similar experience with transition. The idea of it is very good, and I think the impetus and questions behind transition towns is appropriate for community scale process. I think that's the key point, is to think about what's possible, not just at the home scale, but when you start reaching outside the home scale into the larger community. What size is that community? At what scale are you working? And so it's sort of like appropriate choices or appropriate technologies of community building at different scales, I think is the point I would like to make.
And like anything else, as you were saying, Milton, like any permaculture design, you're going to need to tweak and adapt it to your particular location and situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was very easy for a group of people inexperienced in permaculture to latch on to the things as if they were given, or that these were the steps that you need to take to achieve the goal. Where in actuality, it's really a much more complicated thing, and that it's more of a pattern language, which I think where it's gone now. So
Right.
Yeah, which means that there's a lot of creativity called for in adapting it to your community.
That's a requirement, really. And so our next slide is an example of home birth and breastfeeding, and this is really just about getting back in touch with our natural cycles and natural ways of doing things. Rhonda, do you have something to add here?
I do. Part of the permaculture flower is talking about health and well-being and spiritual well-being. So how mothers and fathers become mothers and fathers, and the setting and choices, and the ability to rethink what it means to bring a child into the world and nurture it in its early life, right? That's the key point here. And so families deciding to have births at home and to breastfeed in whatever way they do it, they need to be supported in making those choices. And also, the community really makes a difference in how successful you are in that. So supporting those people, the mothers and fathers and the children that are coming in, and recognizing that the children born and nourished and supported, and their parents are supported in that kind of environment, makes a huge difference in the child's well-being and in the family's well-being as they go through those early years that are so formative. Home birth was on my list. Didn't necessarily happen, but it was definitely a supportive, amazing process to work with a midwife and have a child. And I nursed both of my children for more than 1 year, and they, I think, were really, it was a beautiful thing to have that as part of their life and part of my life.
So our next slide is a little bit about complementary and holistic medicine. In the case of complementary medicine, it's referring to practices that work in conjunction with traditional medicine. So if you're doing a traditional procedure, say like chemotherapy or something like that, then you could perhaps bring in something like acupuncture to try to counteract some of the negative effects of that, which is a little different from holistic medicine, which is where you're really focused on the whole person rather than the malady or the disease that you're dealing with. And so these are fundamentally different practices from the prevailing model of medicine. And these include things like homeopathy, naturopathy, chiropractic, acupuncture, Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, to name just a few.
for me, I think the takeaway is that we can all benefit from taking a more active role in our own health and well-being in whatever way that we need to.
Yeah. Well, if Mollison was saying, one of his aphorisms is take responsibility now,
Right.
then preparing your own food and, making your own medicines, even with tinctures or salves, knowing how to work yoga practice, those things benefit you. And when I think about this, I think about this is how we work with our own bodies. So not just working with nature, but we're working with our own bodies to maintain strength and health and vitality and the ability to age well.
We are the experts of our own selves. Nobody knows us better than we do, than you know yourself. And I think losing sight of that in terms of medicine is has really done us harm.
This is what we sometimes call zone 00. This is the self, and it takes just as much design and consideration into taking care of ourselves as it does the home system or even broad scale. So this next slide, the slide on the left is about spirit of place and reconnecting with spiritual and cultural values to our place and where we're at. And this is an important one for me because it's something that I don't really have much connection to. Growing up in a somewhat transitory situation, I moved a lot, and so I didn't really get to have that indigenous knowledge of a place, to know how the seasons change in a specific area, and to have the experience of watching a place change over time. This is something that I think there's a great deal of value in, that I kind of envy people that get that opportunity.
As a culture, we've all lost some form of that. We can ignore where we are because we pull resources from all over the place. That place that we live, we'd be much more tuned into it if our survival depended upon that place.
And then our slide on the right is about dying with dignity, which is essentially just really trying to reclaim our own natural processes from institutionalized medicine and observing and honoring the natural cycle of life. And speaking for myself, I know that I would much rather, pass at home with my loved ones around me rather than, in a hospital bed in this really clinical and unnatural environment.
I only hope that I am so lucky.
Okay, our next slide is talking about, the one on the left is about local and regional currencies. This is an example of the Brixton pound, which is in a suburb of London, where this currency runs alongside the existing currency. So you'll have a number of local businesses that will accept it, and I believe it's in Brixton that the mayor actually accepts his full annual salary in Brixton pound, and they've even adapted it that you can pay by text, so you can show up at a shop and just an exchange of simple SMS text, and the entire thing happens virtually. So it's just a great way of building resilience in local communities and keeping wages and money cycling within the system, because it's only good in Brixton. It can't go anywhere else. So that really keeps that area a lot more secure and a lot more vibrant.
A way of insulating community from the larger economic shocks. Yeah, and there are a lot of ways to design these. John Rogers, who's from Wales but travels around, has taught a workshop called Let's Make Money and talks about the design of currencies. There are a lot of ways to design currencies to have specific functions in a community. So they might pass along educational routes or healthcare routes or transportation routes, lines throughout the community, and be able to fulfill a specific mission in doing so.
That makes me think about what is the mission of our current currency system? And how does that enrich or not our communities?
Well, that gets into things around, how is currency created, and it's based on trust, which is a huge piece to invisible structures of all kind.
Yeah.
And trust really is generated in a community. Complementary and alternative currencies, time banks, systems, local exchange trading systems, barterings and clothing swaps, and all those forms of of exchange strengthen community.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Which moves us on to our slide on the right, which is just meant to give an image of carpooling, ride sharing, and car shares, and just more efficient use of existing cars on the road and trying to maximize usage while conserving resources as much as possible. And our next slide is on ethical investment and fair trade, and it's really just using the power of investment and consumption to improve economies. I like to point out that nothing is neutral when it comes to virtually anything, but in this case, money. And you can use it to do good things or bad things. And the slide on the left is an example of a very large cooperative in the UK, just called the Cooperative, and they have various different manifestations, but this is a bank which functions along the concepts behind a cooperative.
Mm-hmm. I like to point out that some of the first mutual aid societies were the mutual aid societies that were formed for firefighters and farmers. Firefighters in Chicago formed some of the first insurance agencies, and they were meant to support the families, widows, and orphans of firefighters. That's where insurance comes from, right? Is from that pooling together of resources to create something that provides security and allows people to engage in work without the worry and anxiety of what might happen. And we have the power, or should have the power, to create such mutual aid organisms in our own communities.
And then the slide on the right is a couple of farmers harvesting quinoa in Ecuador, and the point here being fair trade, the idea that if we are drawing these inputs from a distance, that we should just make sure that the people that are harvesting and producing these things are getting a fair wage for their work.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the choices that we make with our money can have far-ranging effects.
And if we want to source locally, those people should be paid fairly as well.
Indeed. So this is about farmers markets and community-supported agriculture, which we also call CSAs. And this, to me, is really kind of where the rubber hits the road. This is the second most direct relationship you can have with your food. These are where you get to know the people that are actually producing it. And you get to know how your food is grown, where your food is grown, and if you have enough of a connection with the farmers and the people behind it, you might even have a say in what is grown. And that, I think, is fundamentally different from the society we currently live in. And this next one is about WWOOFing, which is Willing Workers on Organic Farms, and similar networks where people, essentially this is caught on as ecotourism. A lot of people will travel to far-flung locations and put in a little bit of elbow grease working on organic farms and learning how their food is grown, learning how to grow food, gaining knowledge while they're helping other people out in return for room and board. And so it's a great way to see the world, a great way to connect with other people doing similar work and expand your knowledge base.
And I think about there's a couple thoughts here. One is Richard Heinberg gave an address to the E.F. Schumacher Society in October of 2010 and said that in the next decade, so by 2020, we meaning the United States, need 53 million new farmers. And WWOOFing, the people who WWOOF and who get experience apprenticing on farms, urban or rural, will have an advantage, In Cuba, during the special period, doctors and lawyers gave up their professions in order to become farmers because they were so valued. So we need a lot more of them. But the other thing that I think of here is that WWOOFing and other networks have their own invisible structures. So they are a piece of learning and education and travel, but they're also need to have good agreements, good boundaries, clear, a clarity to them, and processes for communication that protect both the farmer and the woofer.
Sure. This slide is about tradable energy quotas, also known as emissions trading and cap and trade. And the concept here is that certain businesses will buy credits that will allow a certain amount of pollution. And if you pollute less than that allotted amount, you can sell those credits to another organization or company that is polluting more in order to try keeping things in balance. I'm a little bit more suspect and toward this concept. I find it a little bit dubious, but it does exist and should be mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's just a way for the existing infrastructure to buy away their guilt.
My thought as well.
Yeah. So,
It's another commodity market,
Yeah.
essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Get rich.
Another way to make money.
yeah. So in that way, it makes it a monoculture, right?
Indeed. And this next slide, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this. I think this is an area where we would all do well to spend a little bit more time considering. The slide on the left is indicating life cycle analysis, which is the source to sink lifetime of virtually anything that we come into contact with, anything from a tomato to an iPhone and everything in between. What materials went into producing it? Where did it have to, what kind of packaging went into it? Where did it have to go? How long was its period of use? What happens after it's retired? And I think we would all do well to consider that with everything that we purchase and come into contact with. I think it might change a lot of our buying habits and on our considerations going into these things. On the right is a somewhat convoluted graphic for Emergy accounting, which was created by Howard T. Odom, which is really about looking at the embodied energy that goes into anything, what went into producing that particular item, and what resources were used, how much physical labor and energy went into it, and at some point also understanding that there is a point where the energy return on energy invested is beyond what the actual value of that particular item may be. There may be more energy embodied into something than you're getting back from it. So that's an important thing to consider in your energy accounting.
Corn ethanol, anyone?
Well, and Holmgren was deeply influenced by this kind of thinking, and it's in his Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability book, which is really good thinking. So that's a good place to go from there.
And our next slide is about co-ops, cooperatives, and body corporates, and some examples of things that functional systems for owning land and working together. The one on the left is a particular favorite of mine, which is a community land trust, which is a way to keep affordable properties available to people who need them, and also removing it from the speculative market, so that it's not something that is sold to developers and it just keeps driving up the property values of a place so that it gentrifies and people can't afford it. It's basically a group of people that will come together and buy a property or buy land and hold that land in perpetuity, and then do long-term leases for the property that's built on it, which is owned by the person that comes in, and you basically have like a 99-year lease on the space, and you can share in the equity, but you can't take the land with you if and when you leave. So it really keeps spots available for low-income affordable housing, and it keeps gentrification from occurring, which is a current problem in a lot of areas right now. And then on the right is a picture of a local food co-op here in Chicago called Dill Pickle, which is it's a publicly owned co-op, which means that you can buy a share of the place, and then you also have a vote. You have a voice in how the place functions, and then you're able to buy locally, as much as possible, locally grown food, and be a part of a community focused on this.
This points to different models for how we own things and how we use things. I think there's much more beyond this that we could go into. The bottom line is that there are more than just the ways we're used to doing things to organize around land and property.
I think the key to cooperatives and land trusts are that there are many voices included in the decision making, which can be a lengthy process, but really important for for pursuing the overall long-term well-being of the land, or the food scene, or that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Functioning under the concept that everyone has a piece of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and then our next one is an example of co-housing and eco-villages, which are a subject near and dear to my heart. I'm a big fan of these. I've been able to visit several and seen them function. And the one on the left is a co-housing village it's called Highland Gardens Village in Denver, Colorado. And then on the right is Ashley Vale Eco Village in Bristol in the United Kingdom. And they're essentially similar concepts. They're ecologically designed intentional communities where the residents are connected by some degree of shared ownership and organization. There's some dividing lines between them, which are somewhat, they kind of shift a bit, but co-housing tends to be a little bit more focused on the social, whereas eco-villages are sometimes a little bit more focused on the ecological concerns, but that's not true in every case. What they do have in common is that they're usually will have smaller footprint clustered housing centered around a large community building where resources are shared, anything from washing machines and dishwashers to shared car schemes and the like, where there'll be shared meals and whatnot. And so there's just two really, really great examples for really, really good, solid functional models for living.
It makes me think of the models that we have for living that are presented as normal, and really they represent one end of a spectrum. But there's a lot of different ones that we just fail to explore, or even lack the awareness of.
Well, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind with co-housing and eco-villages is the stress and strain put on nuclear families. And the idea of the American dream, where everybody has, 2.3 children and their house, and every so many years they get a bigger house and property and all of that. And it's a lot of stress for people, and it gets more and more difficult as we go through more economic upheaval and resource limitations. And it makes a lot more sense to look at, what did we have before socially and culturally? We lived in villages. We lived in larger households. We shared work. We shared resources. And that's what this is turning toward in a joyful way, where, agreements are thought out, freedoms are maintained, and shared. And I think that's valuable. So I see co-housing of all kinds taking different forms, and eco-villages forming out of neighborhoods.
On some levels, the idealized version of what a household should be and how it should function might not be obtainable given the other requirements on people for work or for community involvement. It kind of always puts you at a loss, where you're always scraping to catch up, get the laundry done, do the cleaning, whatever. Where looking to other models might relieve some of that pressure and be very functional.
And this next slide is about native title and traditional use rights. The idea of honoring who was here before us, and it's in no way even controversial to say that here in the United States, Native Americans have been stripped away from their entire way of life, most of their land resources, and so this is about preserving and restoring as much as possible the rights and interests of Native people to live in the area, to use that area for their traditional purposes, and to protect important places and sites, sacred sites, and to hunt, fish, and gather on their land, and to teach their native laws and rituals to their people in place.
If we talk about somebody being native, then what's the opposite? That are we invaders, and then how do we become native? And kind of in my own practice, I see that as being the ultimate goal, that we need to be of a place, not just from a place, but of it, and linked to all the things that go on there.
For me, the work that Nature Connection and Art of Mentoring are doing, where I think that they complement permaculture and we have the same aims. And so, honoring the right for people to use a space to preserve their language and their customs and their practices is very much true. And I look at our culture and see holes and gaps, things that got lost along the way. And the Art of Mentoring people are really excellent at not cultural appropriation, but at identifying the pieces that are missing in our culture, that are present in other cultures that are more whole, and then helping people begin to find for themselves the things that they need to do to live a more whole life, to fill in the pattern language, so to speak. And so there's no one right answer, because people are different and they come from different places. But exactly, Milton, how do you become native to a place?
And our last slide is on open space technology and consensus decision making, and these are just tools for sharing knowledge and reaching decisions together. Open space is just another way to host meetings and conferences, and doesn't really have a formal agenda beyond the overall purpose and theme. So that's one way of trying to figure things out. And then on the right is an example of consensus decision-making process, which is where a group of people will go through, have a set agenda and go through and try to sort these things out so that it's not the tyranny of the majority, where 51% of a group of people have total say over the remaining 49%. This is where the idea is to get everyone heard, and as we mentioned earlier, the idea that everyone has a piece of the truth and that we'll arrive at a better result if everyone is heard. Consensus is very tricky, so there are modified forms of consensus that I'm personally a big fan of. Some examples being things like holacracy and sociocracy that are a little bit easier to manage, particularly with a large group of people. But it's just another great way of making, really counteracting the prevailing model that we exist in, where a large group of people kind of hold the rest of the group hostage. This is an area where we can really communicate with each other and feel heard. Even if the result is not exactly what we were after, we'll at least know that we're all on the same page, knowing where everyone stands.
And I think a thing that goes along well with this is just learning basic nonviolent communication techniques.
Mm-hmm.
This to me speaks of looking at the mechanics of how we're interfacing and how people can interface back, really using networks and the ability of people to do other things than just a top-down kind of model, which is so easy and effective in certain scenarios, but not effective in others.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and this is Designed for Invisible Structures. So we went through education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finances, economics, and land tenure and community governance. And so hopefully that gives you a much broader spread on what permaculture is actually about, beyond gardening and swales and that sort of thing. There's actually a lot more to it that you don't see, and that's what this is about.
Wonderful.
Very good.